Hey guys and girls, and welcome to another Killing Floor 2 SDK guide by yours truly. My name is Sean, also known as Sean Chaos or Sin Chaos, and in this video I'll be showing you how to set up some of your lighting for your Killing Floor 2 custom maps. We'll be looking at world lighting by using skylights and lighting volumes, dominant directional lights, as well as be looking into detail lighting and the various types of lights available for us to use, such as point lights, spotlights, movable spotlights, as well as looking at shadow maps and light map resolutions, and talking a bit about general level optimizations and light performance optimizations that we can and should be considering when building a level. So let's just get right into it. I've got this little tutorial map that I put together really quickly. Right now I'm looking at it in the unlit mode, which is this one, Alt-3 on the keyboard. If I go into lit mode, which is what you would see in game, everything is very, very dark and very black, because right now my level doesn't have any lighting whatsoever. So let's go back to unlit and let's do something about this. The very first thing that you want to add to your map is probably a skylight. So let's just go back to lit mode and open up our content browser up here. We're going to go into our actor classes up here. We're going to go find our light, which is here. We open up the light and we have this thing called a skylight. I'm just going to drag this directly into my map. And now something happened. We got light on some things, not everything. And that's because our skylight, if we open up the properties, open up our light component, go into our light component here, we can also open up the skylight component. We go into our lighting channels, we can now see that this skylight is set to affect the indoor lighting channel only. I want this to affect the outdoor lighting channel, not the indoor. Okay, we're going to set this to outdoor, and again nothing happened. But there's a reason for that. I'm going to show you in just a second. Because you can just have one skylight, but I would highly advise that you have two. So I'm just going to clone this by holding on the Alt key and dragging in a new one. This second one I'm going to set to be on the indoor lighting channel instead of the outdoor. Now when you have two skylights, an outdoor and an indoor, you're going to have to use some lighting volumes. So for the purpose of level design in Killing Floor 2, you really only need one type of lighting volume, and that's the indoor one. So I'm just going to quickly create one right now. I'm going to get my builder brush by hitting this cube thing. That's going to put my brush over here. If you can't see your brush, then it's probably because it's hidden. Try hitting the B key on your keyboard. That hides and unhides it. I'm going to drag this up. Right now I don't really care where it is or what shape it is. I just want to make sure that I have a volume. I'm going to make sure that my indoor light, skylight, is inside of it, while my outdoor skylight is not. This one must not be inside of my indoor lighting volume. So I'm going to take my brush, I'm going to hit this volume box here. I'm going to click on the TW indoor lighting volume. I'm going to move my brush, oops, or just hide it with the B button. And now I have this nice indoor lighting box volume. And my indoor skylight is inside of it. So if I go ahead and build everything, including the lighting on my map, you should see a dramatic difference. There we go. We have light everywhere. Beautiful. But it's not very pretty, it's very bright. That's because these are just default right now. Now skylights, the way that you should think about a skylight is more of sort of an ambient light. Skylights do not cast shadows. They don't shine their light from any specific direction. They light everything everywhere all the time, no matter what. So it really is, it's ambient illumination. So for my outdoor lights, we want to be not at a brightness of 1. I'm going to set this, usually most level designers set the outdoor skylight, well, just generally skylights, at a fairly low setting. I'm going to do this at 0.1. I'm going to change the color a bit, because this is an outdoor skylight, so I want to have sort of a midday afternoon sun tinge. Something along the lines of, I think this for now is okay. Okay, I'm going to hit OK. And now this changes the lighting, as you saw, all around my map. Now in my indoor lighting, nothing really happened because my indoor lighting is confined to this area floating in space. If I were to move this, just go into geometry mode so that I can control it a bit more. I'm going to place this inside my house because I do want my indoor lighting to be working in here, obviously. I'm just going to place this so that it intersects the walls and the floors and everything else inside the house, as much of it as possible. I'm going to reshape it to better fit, as it were, as well as the top here. Right, I think that's okay. We go all the way up there. That's fine. Now remember, I just moved my indoor lighting volume, so now I need to move my indoor skylight along with it. It needs to be inside of it, otherwise it's not going to work. It's going to get confused. Now, if I go ahead and rebuild everything here once again, we're going to see a dramatic difference between the skylight, the outdoor skylight, and the indoor skylight. See that? My indoor area is super bright because my indoor skylight is super bright, but everything in my outdoor remains the same as what I set this one to. Now I can change the colors of these to really demonstrate it. If I were to change my indoor to some stupid color like pink, or the indoor goes pink, while the outside remains this night, summer, midday, whatever you want to call this color. So there's a stark difference, and now everything in here receives lighting only from the indoor and everything out here from the outdoor. Beautiful. I want this to also affect my tunnel over here, so I'm just going to clone my indoor lighting volume. I'm going to drag it over here, reshape it to encompass this entire thing. There we go. And drag it up here to about here so that it's intersecting the insides. That looks okay. Now you don't need you don't want to have more than 2 skylights in your map. Even if you have multiple indoor lighting volumes, you still only need 1 skylight. And as long as this skylight is inside one of your indoor lighting volumes, it will affect all of the indoor lighting volumes. So if I rebuild again, this whole tunnel is going to turn an ugly pink. There we go. Now the outdoor bits also turn pink. That's not very pretty. But that's because they are all encompassed within the indoor lighting volume. We can change that. We can simply mark them and override the lighting channel. The way we do this, once I've finished marking, is I pull up the properties of the static mesh. I open up this, go into a static mesh component, and I go into the lighting. And in here we have lighting channels. As you can see, the engine has determined that these meshes were deep enough inside of the indoor lighting volume so that the engine assumed that these should be receiving indoor lighting volume. Even though I've decided that's not the case, I want these to have outdoor lighting volume. So instead of readjusting this volume, you could do that. We could shape this volume to really fit this very nicely, but it can be difficult. It takes some time. I have a guide showing you how to do that. I'm not going to be doing this for this video. Instead, I'm just going to override these. So I'm going to change the lighting channel to outdoor and remove it from indoor. There we go. Now they have outdoor lighting, even though they are technically inside the indoor lighting. But if I were to rebuild now, something annoying would happen. Once the light has finished building, these are going to revert back to that ugly pink. Why? Because, as I said, these are touching the indoor lighting volume enough that the engine, when it builds the light, it automatically assumes that these are supposed to receive indoor lighting because they are inside the indoor lighting volume. So in order to prevent that from happening every time I rebuild the light, not only do I need to change these to the outdoor, I also need to tell the engine to override the auto lighting channels. This will prevent the engine from trying to figure things out itself and just do exactly what I tell it to do. Now, when I rebuild, these are going to remain in the outdoor lighting channel and not be changed back to the indoor. keep that in mind. That's probably something a lot of you will have struggled with. So these things, I'm not going to bother with this because nobody's going to see it anyway. I'm just going to do it on these. Just to reiterate, we change them to the outdoor and we hit this override auto lighting channels, and now everything is right in the world. This floor actually receives outdoor lighting when I want it to receive indoor lighting. That's a bother. I can just do the exact same thing, just the opposite. I change them from outdoor to indoor and tell the engine to not change what I have done and just ignore it and keep them on the indoor. But this is actually giving me a headache to look at, so let's get rid of that ugly color. Let's find a different indoor lighting color. Let's do sort of a dark gray. A depressive dark bluish gray color for the indoor lighting. And I want to set the indoor lighting to a fairly low value. Let's try 0.5. That's very dark. Perhaps too dark. I set it to 0.05. I wanted to set it to 0.5. That's too bright. 0.1, 0.0, I don't know, 9. That's fine, that's fine. Let's, before we actually finish up the skylights, I want to talk about the lower brightness as well. Because, as you can see, the floor is quite nicely lit. These things, well, they're sort of, they seem to be darker than the floor, don't they? And especially the ceiling. Actually, this tunnel needs to receive indoor lighting instead of outdoor. Or does it? Maybe I want it to receive both, because when you look at it from the outside, it looks stupid. You know what? I'm going to set it to receive lighting from both the indoor and the outdoor. You can do that, but it might not look as good. But that, you know, that's some adjustment you're going to have to do. So, back to the lower brightness of my indoor skylight. We open up the properties, and we have up here, if we change this to some low number, 0.1, you can see how now even the top sections got a little brighter. We do 0.1, it gets a lot brighter. We do like 5, it gets ridiculously bright. So the lower brightness changes, it's sort of a fine-tuning of the lighting received, especially by measures that are vertical and things such as ceilings. Whereas the overall brightness mostly affects the floor. We can also change the color of the lower brightness to be different if we want to. We could set it to have sort of a reddish pink orange tinge, whatever we want it to be. Okay, now for the outdoor skylight, we're going to do the same. And just a little trick I'm going to show you here, because these skylights can be quite difficult to locate, can't they? They're very small. If we if we scroll down here to what's called the display, we have what's called the draw scale. We can change this to a really high number, and that changes the skylight icon so that it's easier to find. Also, it doesn't matter where you put these. It literally doesn't matter. But in terms of volumes, we've created indoor lighting volumes. We did not create any outdoor lighting volumes. We don't need to, and you shouldn't. You don't need an outdoor lighting volume. The engine will automatically figure out, as long as there is an indoor lighting volume, it will realize that everything else should be set to outdoor. So don't create an outdoor lighting volume. Now, I know the logic would dictate that you should create one huge outdoor lighting volume encompassing your entire map and then create indoor lighting volumes inside of it. No, do not do that. You don't need it. It's just going to get confusing. It's going to cause trouble. All you need is at least one indoor lighting volume with your indoor skylight inside of it. That's all you need. Period. Stop there. Don't start creating outdoor lighting volumes. Just don't. Create one or more indoor lighting volumes, and that's it. Okay, let's take a look at the second type of light that we want in a map like this, which is a dominant directional light. I'm going to go back into actor classes. I'm going to go into directional light, open this up, and we have one here called dominant directional light. I'm going to pull this into my map, and this is going to light up everything. And that's because the dominant directional light, the best way to think of this is your sun or your moon. If it's a night map, it's your moon. If it's a daylight map, it's your sun. You can only have one of these in your map. And this is not just a suggestion. This is a literal limit. The engine will not allow you to have any more of these. You can only have one, and that's fine. Now, the difference between a dominant directional light and a skylight, because like the skylight, this lights up everything in the lighting channel that it is configured to light up. Now, we only want this to be on the outdoor lighting channel, so I'm going to remove the indoor lighting. But the difference between a skylight is that the dominant directional, one, it casts shadows, and two, it casts its light from a specific angle, right? See what happens when I start dragging things? Actually, if I rebuild lighting now, you will see shadows. Ta-da! And these shadows are dynamic. They move as I move the light. I can move it sideways, I can tilt it up and down, elongate the shadows, make everything really fucked up, and you know, just basically fuck everything up. I think this looks cool. Nice elongated shadows. Cool. And these are all dynamic, because by default, a dominant directional light will be casting dynamic shadows. If we open up this one, Cascade Shadow Maps, we see this option here, whole scene dynamic shadows radius, 750. That's the default value. And you'll notice that the shadows pop in and out of view as I move away and close to them. And that's controlled by this. If I increase this, let's do double, 1500. See, I can move a lot further away before the shadows vanish. But you may have also noticed that the quality got degraded. They're not as sharp. If I go back to 700, the shadows become a lot sharper, but they get cut off. They get culled a lot sooner. So that's a trade-off. You have to decide what you want. Do you want really nice and crisp shadows that get cut off very quickly? Or do you want to set a higher distance so that you can see the dynamic shadows from much further away, but once you get closer, you can tell that they're not as high quality? Or, and this is also a judgment call you need to make yourself, do you want to set the whole scene dynamic shadows to 0? What does that mean? It means it no longer casts any dynamic shadows, but it still casts static shadows. Alright? So we do have static shadows, but there's no dynamic shadows. And this really does kind of depend on what kind of map you're making, because as you can see, this tree doesn't cast any shadows at all. And that's because there are certain meshes that just don't cast static shadows. So if you remove the dynamic shadows of your dominant light, you may end up with certain meshes not casting any shadows. But it is a big performance increase to do this. Having your dominant directional light not cast dynamic shadows is a big performance increase. And the static shadows still look good. You still have static shadows. So you kind of have to make up your mind what you want to do in terms of shadows with your dominant directional light. I actually want to see now my dynamic shadows and static shadows, they're not aligned, and that's because I haven't rebuilt since I changed the yaw and pitch of my light. So you need to rebuild to get the static shadows to properly show up. There we go. There they are. And also another disadvantage, you see how these, for some reason, they won't cast dynamic shadows when I get close, but once I get far enough away for them to be replaced with static shadows, it looks fine. It looks good. They're not as crisp as the dynamic ones, but we can certainly change that. We can just take this floor plate, go into the static mesh component, and up here we have something called Lightmap Resolution. It's set to 256. We can override this. Let's do 1024. That's quite high. But on a mesh like this, where the shadows are very noticeable and add a really cool effect to your map, you should probably be setting a pretty high Lightmap resolution because it's going to look really good. And let me just show you. I'm going to select this plate. I'm going to build the light only. I'm going to make sure that I have this option ticked. Build only selected. That's going to rebuild the shadows only on this instead of everything else. So it's going to happen really quickly. Now if I move out of, see how those shadows now? Those are the static shadows. They look like they're dynamic, but they're not. They're static. Only once we get close, our dynamic casting sun kind of fucks us up. But if we set this back to 0 so that it doesn't cast dynamic shadows, watch the magic happen. There you go. beautiful static shadows that don't pop in and out of view no matter how far away or how close you are. So, yep. This is a judgment call. What do you want? In my opinion, I tend to set this to 0. My dynamic light, my dominant dynamic directional light, I usually set to 0. Literally, unless, I mean, if you're making a forest map with tons and tons of trees, you're probably better off setting this to cast dynamic shadows, because otherwise you're going to have a forest with practically no shadows. Actually, let me just test something. If I take this tree and set it to cast shadows as two-sided, I'm going to rebuild the lighting on this. I'm going to see if that does anything. I don't think it will. No. No, because this is a limitation of the mesh. This is the model itself is configured to just not cast static shadows. So you kind of have to decide that for yourself. Right, so that's our sun. I'm going to change the color of it because this is an ugly color. I want to get it into sort of like a noonday sun. And I want to lower the brightness to, let's try 0.25. That's pretty cool. Alright, good. So we've got skylights covered, we've got dominant directional light covered, our sun. Now let's take a look at, and those were what you could call world lighting. They light up your world, your whole world. Now we're going to go look at detail lighting. In terms of detail lighting, we have, if we go into light, we have what's called a point light and a spotlight. These are the two you will be using the most, and there's a pretty big difference between the two. So the point light, if we go into the radius here, point light component, radius. The point light is a 360 degrees sphere. It emits light in this entire round cube and lights up everything inside of it. The light is brightest towards the center and slowly falls off towards the edges. This is an expensive light to be using because the light frustum is so huge. It radiates lights in all directions. The spotlight emits light in a cone. I do realize there's a big sphere around it, but that only indicates the radius. That is not this does not indicate that it casts light in this area. It does not. The light of a spotlight only casts in this pyramid shape. So, in terms of rendering cost, a spotlight costs only roughly 1/5 of what a point light does. So a spotlight is 5 times more performance efficient than a point light. That's a big difference. That's why I would advise, whenever you can, if it makes sense and if you can make it look good, try to use spotlights instead of point lights. These will help your map performance. Also, another hugely important factor, and I'm going to repeat this multiple times because I want to make sure that you understand it. On a point light, we have this option which is enabled by default, cast per object dynamic shadows. Turn it off right now. On a point light, you do not want this option turned on. Remove it. On all your point lights, every single one, throughout your entire map. If you have an entire map full of point lights, right click one of them right now, go into select, and select all point light actors. That will select all the point lights in your entire map, and whatever options you set will affect all of them. And you just go in there right now and you remove this option. Why? I'll tell you why. Because cast per object dynamic shadows will cast dynamic shadows from Zs and players and the environment if it is allowed to do so. But on a point light, this feature, first of all, is broken. It doesn't work. Not properly anyway. What happens is you're going to see shadows that aren't properly working. They will be flickering. They will be turning on and off randomly when you look away or look at them at a specific angle. And second of all, it's hugely expensive in terms of performance. So you are paying a huge performance increase, or a decrease, I guess. It's an important performance impact on your map for something that doesn't even properly work. Now, on Spotlights, you can leave it on. On Spotlights, it's okay, because on Spotlights, it is not broken, it works, and because the Spotlight is only 1/5 the render cost, having these options enabled isn't quite as impactful as on a point light. So that's just a... I'm almost I'm almost tempted to say that it's not an advice, that I'm literally telling you to do this. Do not have cost per object dynamic shadows on your point lights. It's very, very important. Just trust me. Right. So how do we use these guys? Let's actually get these placed. I want to have this one. We have a lamp in here, and it would make sense for us to have a point light on this lamp, because such a lamp like this would be casting a 360-degree light. So I'm going to drag this in here. I'm going to set it to only affect the indoor lighting channel, because if it affects both, as you can see, it's going to bleed through the walls and light up the outside, which makes no sense. So I can disable the outdoor and only have it light the indoor, because I have my indoor lighting volume, right? That's why having indoor lighting volumes is really important. But because I have the indoor lighting volume, I don't even have to manually do this. The engine itself will figure out, hey, this light is inside of an indoor lighting volume. So when I rebuild everything, including the lights, the engine will figure out on its own that this light in here should only affect the indoor lighting volume, lighting channel, and not the outdoor. As you can see, I rebuilt the light, and this has automatically set itself to only affect the indoor lighting. I'm going to do the same thing with my spotlights. I'm going to drag these in here. I've got some lamps. There's one here. I'm going to put it up there. Go into lit mode and nothing happens. And that's because this light, when I rebuilt the light, this was outside. Remember what I said earlier? The engine figures out that everything that is not inside of an indoor lighting volume must default to outdoor lighting. So this one is now set to outdoor. I'm just going to change that to indoor, and there we go. Now we have light. Now on a spotlight, I like having a quite high brightness because it tends to look good on spotlights. And unlike the point lights, spotlights have a few more options. We have something called spotlight component, inner cone angle and outer cone angle. We can set this, let's set this, the outer one to 40 and set the indoor one to 15. That gives us just a bit more detail on the lighting. See how the indoor sort of brightens more than the outdoor? It's just a function that makes it look really cool. I think the radius is a bit extensive. I'm going to set this to 512. That's fine. And it is casting shadows. It is also casting per object dynamic shadows, which on the spotlight, like I said, is okay. But I would, again, you always have to consider performance. On a light like this, that's so close to a wall, and in an area where players and Zeds will probably not be walking, I would say it would make sense to remove the object dynamic per object dynamic shadows. It doesn't need to be casting those, because nobody's even going to notice it. And if players won't notice it, if it won't have a very clearly visible effect in your map, then you are better off just removing this option, even on a point light, spotlight. Whereas, let's go actually in here, because you'll notice that I have a bus in here, and I want to have a spotlight for my headlights. I'm going to rotate this a bit. Oh, I'm in world, sorry, local. Rotate it a bit and go like this, maybe like this, get a bit more up, bitty up. I think I want to intensify the inner cone by a lot. And the outer cone, well, I think the radius, I'm going to give it a huge radius because I want this to really be like a powerful bright light. So that's one. I want one over here as well. I think I'm going to turn this one a bit. May turn this one even more. Like so. Yes, I think that's okay. Now I want to give them a slightly blue tint to make sort of like a halogen light. Isn't that what it's called? That's okay. Now on a light like these, I would say that definitely enable the per object dynamic shadows, because per object dynamic shadows will ensure that if a Z comes walking through here, his shadow is going to get shown onto this wall, and it's going to look really cool and really menacing. So on a spotlight like this, I'd say it makes sense to have per object dynamic shadows. On a spotlight like this, where chances of anything walking in here is very small and you probably won't notice it, I would disable it. That's a small optimization because, you know, if nobody's going to notice, then you may as well disable it and get a bit better performance out of your map. We can do something else cool with these, actually. Now, one thing we can do is we have this option here called Cast Whole Scene Dynamic Shadows. This one you definitely want to be careful with. This one can be quite expensive. So we already did notice that the shadows changed a bit. See that? The walls are actually casting shadows now. These things are not, but we can certainly make them. If we highlight them and then allow them to cast dynamic shadows, ta-da! We have these really cool looking shadows shining on the walls, and this looks great. But this is expensive, as I said. Generally, you want to be careful having your spotlights casting whole scene dynamic shadows. But you might be asking yourself, well, I really like these shadows. Can I do this with static shadows instead? Because static shadows don't cost anything. And yes, you can. Let's remove the dynamic shadows from the meshes. Click the light and remove the whole scene dynamic shadows as well. Just going to make sure that they're indoor, even though I don't need to do that. And now, if I build the lighting, I'm just going to build the light on these sections here. Build selected only. You can see that there are static shadows, but they're very washed out. They're not very pretty. So we're just going to do exactly the same things we did with this one out here. We just grab these meshes and we increase the Lightmap Resolution. I'm going to say 1024. We're going to build them again. And now we have some decent looking static shadows. Let's be generous. Let's go to 2048. And this, again, every time you increase the Lightmap Resolution, you increase the file size of your map, and also a slight increase to memory load, and the general loading time of your map also slightly increases. But in a situation such as this, I would say this is worth it, because this just looks good, right? This is something that you can really notice. Players are going to notice these shadows and they're going to think, wow, this looks really cool. And these are now static. They're not dynamic. They don't disappear and they cost virtually nothing. So this is a nice performance enhancement without having to really lose anything. I mean, they're not quite as crisp as dynamic, but performance-wise, it's a good trade-off. Speaking of shadow casting, when should a light cast shadows and when should it not? Let me give you an example of this fire out here. First of all, let's get like a fiery color to it, like a deep orange. And let's make it flicker, because this is a fire, right? This should be flickering. So we can go into what's called light animation. We've got something called max brightness and minimum brightness. Let's do 0.6 and then do a flicker. It's a bit fast. Let's reduce the flicker frequency to, I don't know, 0.42. That might look better. There we go. Actually, I think I'm going to decrease my outdoor skylight to 0.025. Yes, I like this. That sort of accentuates the outdoor lighting a bit more. It also darkens the shadows of everything. The skylight controls the density of the shadows. So if we do 0.1, the shadows become brighter. If if we lower it, or even increase it, they become darker. And then we can, if you feel like now the map is too dark, then you can just increase the intensity of your sun, essentially. But I like it at 2.5, which you're just going to leave it there. Now this light, this is a point light, remember that. And currently this is actually affecting both the indoor and the outdoor. You can see it bleeding through the walls. And that's because right now it is casting light on both the indoor and the outdoor. Once we rebuild the light, because it's outside of the indoor lighting volume, it's going to default to outdoor. Or we can do it manually. And once we do that, it no longer bleeds through the walls. Now this is casting static shadows. It is set to cast static shadows. But on a light like this, I would actually say just disable shadow casting entirely. Because there's nothing here from which this really casts shadows off. You know, this doesn't really affect any nearby shadows. So it's a nice optimization to just remove the shadow casting entirely, and it's still going to look good. People won't notice the difference between this casting shadows or not. Whereas in here, that people will definitely notice. If we remove shadow casting from this, see that? That's a huge difference. That's a shame. We want this to be casting shadows because players will notice. On a light like this, we don't want it casting shadows because nobody's going to notice the difference. So it's a performance increase by removing the shadow casting. I would even say we could do the same in here. See that? There is a difference, but it's not big. Most players probably won't notice. So I would even advocate you could take off shadow casting on a light like this. I'd even dare say you could do it on this. You don't really need these casting shadows. But it's a judgment call. You have to make up this, you know, you have to decide for yourself. Just keep in mind, if you can increase your performance without losing any significant visual detail, then do it. If it isn't noticeable, you're better off just disabling a feature because you get better map performance and nobody's going to tell the difference anyway. So let's just build everything again and see how it looks. And obviously, the higher shadow map resolution, light map resolutions you set, the more you also increase the build time. So that's also worth taking into account. Let's actually change the color of these a bit. Give them like a blue tint. Cool. Looks nice. Well, it's not super nice, but you know, it's something. And that's basically how you work with point lights and spotlights and what the difference are between them. Do they need to be casting shadows, and so on and so on. We can actually, there's another type of light that we can put in here that's also quite fun to use. If you go into actor classes, go into spotlight and pick up a spotlight movable. We drag this on here. Let's change this to a bright red color. You give it a high intensity, like 3. Give it a very sharp inner cone. This is like a very aggressive light. And then this one, because this is a moving light, we can go down here to movement. Now we set the physics, right? We set these to rotating. And then once we start messing around with these numbers down here, things will start happening. 90. Okay, that's the wrong direction. Obviously, that's not the way I wanted it to be turning. But you get the idea. I don't know exactly which feature I need to be messing with here for this to properly work. That certainly wasn't it. What the hell is it? That's not it either. I guess it's a mix. 90 of that, 90 of that. Well, this is sort of a psychedelic disco light, whatever. You can mess around with this on your own, but you get the general idea. A movable spotlight allows you to do really cool things like these. And again, should it be casting shadows? Should it not? Ideally, I'd say on a spotlight like this that actually moves, I would say do not cast static shadows. That doesn't make any sense. Does it need to be casting per object dynamic shadows? That's the expensive one. Whole scene dynamic, even more expensive. Maybe. It depends on whether your environment actually casts dynamic shadows or not. Overall, I would say you're probably better off just removing the shadow casting entirely, although that will cause it to bleed through walls, as you can see. So this is like an adjustment case. You need to mess around with it to get the right settings. And I think that basically covers what you could say is the basic lighting. Skylights, you want 2 in your map, 1 set on the outdoor channel, 1 set on the indoor channel. Make sure that you have at least 1 indoor lighting volume with your indoor skylight inside of it. Do not make an outdoor skylight volume, outdoor lighting volume. Use a dominant directional light if you wish. Whether you want it to cast dynamic shadows or not is up to you. Just remember, dynamic shadows are expensive. They will degrade your map performance, especially if you use a lot of them. And on point lights especially, never ever have this enabled. And just whole scene dynamic shadows, no. Just no. Do not use them. Not on a point light. If you want to cast dynamic shadows, use a spotlight. Never use a point light. Okay? Before I wrap this up, I want to show you a demonstration map that I've created with a nice comparison of Lightmap Resolutions, which was the setting that controlled sort of the crispness, the detail of your static shadows. Once it finishes loading, there we go. So you can see these are Lightmap Resolutions set on the walls. A Lightmap Resolution of 4 is not even visible. You can't tell the difference. 8, you can't tell the difference. 16, you can sort of tell something's going on. Very, very little. 32, you can't even tell what it is. You can just tell that, well, there's something going on. It looks like smudges. It doesn't even look like shadows, does it? 64 starts to become somewhat resemblant of shadows. At 128, you can definitely tell these are shadows, but they're not very good quality. 256 are, well, okay, yeah, alright. They're shadows, they're not very pretty, but they're definitely shadows, and you can start seeing some detail. At 512, you can definitely start to tell the details are coming through. You can easily tell what's going on here. At 1024, things are really ugly because this hasn't been built. That is a mistake on my part, excuse me. Let's just rebuild. And wait. Come on. There we go. 1024 looks borderline good. It's almost dynamic shadow quality. Not quite, but it's close. And on 2048, if we go close, and so the static shadows actually do degrade when you move away. But at 2048, when you go close, this is essentially dynamic shadow quality. So that's the difference between the various Lightmap Resolutions. And that is, again, a judgment call you have to make. Are there any significant static shadows being cast on your mesh? If the answer is yes, then just raise the resolution. Make the static shadows look good. If the answer is no, there aren't any significant shadows being cast on it, then lower it. Set it down to something low. Set it to 64, 32. Sometimes I even go as low as 4 if it's like, if we go back to the map we just came from, which was design lighting. Like one of the outdoor floor plates where there's literally no shadows being cast on it, you can easily get away with setting a super low Lightmap resolution. Well, obviously I didn't save it, but on a plate like this where there's no light, you can set a really low resolution and nobody will notice. So I hope this tutorial has helped you out and has gotten you a bit better understanding of how to work with lights and setting up at least your basic lighting for your map. If you have any questions, any suggestions, or any corrections, I mean, I'm not an expert. I'm learning myself just as you are, so feel free to comment and let me know. And otherwise, besides that, I hope you will take these lessons to heart and that they will help you make some excellent custom maps for Killing Floor 2. Until the next time, I'll see you around. Take care and keep mapping. See you around. Bye.